I was in Portland finishing a commission when my parents handed my workshop to my sister for her catering business. When I came back, my grandfather's tools were already in a rented van. "You can build anywhere," my mother said, like that was kindness. I smiled. "What's funny?" my father snapped. I said quietly, "The workshop you gave her actually." And that's when they stopped breathing. My name is Clara. I'm 29, and for the better part of my adult life, the most honest place I knew was a converted garage at the end of a gravel driveway in Knoxville, Tennessee. Not a romantic space. Concrete floor, 2 south-facing windows that let in the kind of afternoon light that makes sawdust look like gold. The smell of linseed oil and cedar, and something underneath both of those, something older, that I always thought was just my grandfather's presence soaked into the walls. He built that workshop the year my grandmother got sick. He said working with his hands was the only way he knew how to pray. By the time I was 7, I was in there with him, standing on an overturned milk crate so I could reach the workbench. He didn't teach me the way schools teach: no curriculum, no tests. He just handed me a chisel and said, "Watch the grain. Follow where the wood wants to go, don't force it." I followed the grain for 22 years. When my grandfather died, he left me the workshop. Not the house that went to my parents. Not the land that was split 3 ways. Just the workshop, the tools inside it, and a handwritten note tucked into the drawer of his old tool chest. It said, "This is where you are most yourself. Don't let anyone talk you out of that." My parents were fine with the arrangement until they weren't. My sister Renee is 3 years younger than me and has been on the verge of her big break since she dropped out of culinary school at 20. She's magnetic in the way that people who've never had to sit quietly with failure tend to be loud and certain and always arriving at the next idea before the last one has fully collapsed. My parents talk about her talent like they witnessed a miracle. Every new plan she presents gets the same wide-eyed attention I spent my entire childhood trying to earn with actual, finished work. I don't resent Renee for being loved. I resent the scoreboard my family keeps without admitting it exists. For me, the arrangement was always simple. I worked, I produced, I asked for very little. My commissions paid my bills. My reputation grew slowly and honestly, the way anything built from scratch tends to grow. I'd spent 4 years establishing a small but loyal client base: furniture for architects who cared about materials, custom cabinetry for people who wanted heirlooms instead of flat pack. The workshop was where all of it happened. Without it, I was just a person with skills and nowhere to use them. Portland was supposed to be temporary. A hotel renovation contractor had reached out through a referral: 12 custom headboards, hand-carved panel work, a 6-week timeline. Good money. The kind of project that would let me upgrade my bandsaw and finally fix the ventilation hood that had been held together with duct tape since 2021. I sublet my apartment, packed a bag, and drove north in October. For 6 weeks, I existed outside my own life. I worked 10-hour days in a rented studio space the contractor provided. I ate takeout and fell asleep early and didn't check in with my family more than once a week because honestly, the distance felt like exhaling. No one called to ask for favors. No one needed me to run interference between my mother and Renee's latest crisis. I just worked. I slept. I woke up and worked again. I finished 2 days early and drove home through rain that didn't quit from Eugene to the Oregon border. I turned onto my grandfather's old street and felt the thing I always felt coming back: a loosening, like the last hour of a headache lifting. The gravel driveway. The oak tree. The workshop light usually visible through the south windows. The windows were dark. I parked and sat for a moment, telling myself it was nothing. I'd been gone. The timer on the outlet strip had probably tripped. I got out. The gravel crunched. The workshop door was unlocked. I pushed it open and reached for the light switch. The benches were cleared. Not cleaned, cleared. The way you clear something when you're moving it, not respecting it. Sawdust in the shapes where things had been, like chalk outlines. The tool wall had bare hooks where my grandfather's hand planes had hung for 40 years. His tool chest, the one with the gouge on the corner from when I'd knocked it off a dolly at 16, my first real lesson in how wood remembers impact, was gone. I stood in the middle of the empty floor and did the thing my body does when it can't immediately process information, nothing. Just stood there while my brain cycled through explanations that made less and less sense. My phone showed a text from my mother. Sent 2 days ago, while I was on the road. Renee needed the space for prep work and storage. Temporary arrangement. Call when you're back. I called. My father answered. Clara. Casual. The tone of a man who had already decided there was no problem here. What happened to the workshop? I asked. A pause, not guilt. Recalibration. We made a practical decision, he said. Renee's catering business is picking up. She needed a commercial kitchen prep space and storage while she waits on her lease. The workshop was sitting empty. It wasn't sitting empty, I said. I was on a job. For 6 weeks, he said. It's my workshop. It's on our property, Clara. There it was. Smooth as a stone he'd been turning over for years, waiting for the right moment to throw it. We've never made an issue of that. But when family needs, where are my tools? Another pause. Renee needed the floor space. The tools are in storage at Dave's. Dave was Renee's boyfriend. I had never once trusted Dave. My mother's voice came on, warm in the way that costs nothing and means nothing. Honey, you can build anywhere. You always find a way. That's what you do. I didn't answer. I stood in the empty workshop and looked at the wall where my grandfather's planes used to hang, and I felt something move through me, not grief, not yet. Something colder and more useful. I called Petra. Petra was not a friend I had brunch with. Petra was a woman I'd met 3 years ago when she helped a sculptor I knew navigate a dispute over a studio lease. She was a contracts and property attorney who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the particular patience of someone who had spent decades watching people underestimate her. She didn't perform urgency. She produced outcomes. Tell me everything, she said. Dates, what was said, what was moved, where it is now. I told her. Don't touch anything in that workshop, she said. Don't move anything back in. And don't talk to your family again until I tell you it's okay. Send me your grandfather's will, the probate records, and any documentation you have on the tools. Equipment serial numbers if you have them. You think there's something here? I asked. I think there might be several somethings, she said. Give me 48 hours. I spent those 48 hours in a motel 12 minutes from my parents' house because going back to my apartment felt like admitting I'd been evicted from my own life. I ordered coffee from a drive-thru and sat in bed going through old emails, looking for every receipt, every insurance renewal, every registration document I'd ever filed for the workshop and its contents. That's when I found it. 3 years ago, when I'd started taking on larger commissions, my accountant had suggested I register the business properly. I'd done it almost on autopilot, set up an LLC, registered it under my name, listed the workshop tools and equipment as business assets. I'd filed the business personal property with the county. Annual declarations. Replacement value appraisals. Everything sitting in a folder in my email like a time capsule I'd forgotten I'd buried. Petra called me back on the second morning. Her voice had the particular quietness of someone holding something sharp. Your parents don't own those tools, she said. I set down my coffee. What? The equipment inside that workshop is registered business property under your LLC. It's not real property. Your parents don't have standing to move it, loan it, or authorize anyone to use it without your consent. What they did the moment they let Renee take possession of those assets without your knowledge is called conversion. In plain language, they helped someone take your property. That's civil liability. Depending on how it was handled, it could also attract a criminal referral. I heard the word criminal and felt something loosen in my chest. There's more, Petra said. Your grandfather's bequest. The will specifies the workshop as a structure. But there's a codicil. Did you know about the codicil? I didn't. Your grandfather added it 6 months before he died. It grants you exclusive right of use and quiet enjoyment of the workshop space for as long as you operate a woodworking trade, regardless of who holds title to the surrounding property. It's a recorded easement, Clara. It's attached to the land. I sat with that for a moment. My grandfather, who taught me to follow the grain and never force the wood, had apparently spent his last months quietly building something structural around me without saying a word. So my parents can't just hand it to Renee, I said. They can't legally remove you from it, restrict your access to it, or use it themselves or through a third party in a way that interferes with your trade. What they did, clearing your tools, giving Renee the space, that's a violation of a recorded easement. We can go after this on multiple tracks. I asked her what I should do. Let me send a letter, she said. Formal notice of the easement, demand for return of the equipment, notice that any further interference carries damages. We send it certified. We send a copy to Dave's address, since that's where the property is. And then we wait and see what your family does next. They didn't wait for the letter to be delivered. My mother showed up at the motel the next afternoon. I don't know how she found me. Small towns have long memories, and everyone knows someone, but she walked into the parking lot like she owned it and knocked on my door with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no and believed her. I opened the door. I didn't invite her in. You hired an attorney, she said. I called a friend, I said. Clara. Her voice was sculpted calm on the surface, pressure underneath. This is a family situation. You don't bring outside people into a family situation. You cleared out my workshop, I said. We made an accommodation. Temporary. For your sister, who is trying to build something. So am I said. So was I. For 5 years, in that workshop. She looked at me with the expression I'd been seeing since I was 12, the one that said I was being difficult in a way that reflected poorly on her parenting. Renee has a real opportunity right now. A catering contract that could change everything for her. She needed the space. She needed my space, I said. There's a difference. We didn't think you'd be this upset. That sentence, the way it transferred the problem from what they'd done to how I was reacting to what they'd done. I'd heard it in so many configurations over so many years that I almost recited it with her. I need the tools back, I said, all of them. Undamaged. Her jaw tightened. You're being dramatic. Monday, I said. If the equipment isn't returned by Monday, Petra files. She left without saying goodbye. I stood in the motel doorway and watched her car back out and thought about my grandfather's note. Don't let anyone talk you out of that. He knew. Of course he knew. The tools were not returned by Monday. Renee called Sunday night. I almost didn't answer, but something made me maybe I still wanted to hear an apology, some small confirmation that my sister understood what had happened. Some part of me that hadn't finished growing up yet. You're going to destroy my contract, she said. Not hello, not I'm sorry, just the complaint, arriving like an invoice. Renee, I said. I have a tasting for 40 people in 2 weeks. I need the prep space. I need the storage. Clara, this is my shot. Those tools are registered under my business, I said. Petra is filing a conversion claim. If Dave's been using them, that's a separate problem. A pause. Then, lower. Nobody used your tools, they're just in the way of the refrigeration units. They're in the way because you put them there. Mom said it was fine. Her voice cracked slightly, not remorse, frustration at an obstacle. She said you wouldn't mind. You were gone. I wasn't gone. I was working. There's a difference. Clara. The word came out with all the weight of our entire childhood in it, the years she'd been the sun, and I'd been a planet nobody was keeping close track of. You can build anywhere, you have skills. You'll be fine, you always land. There it was. My mother's line, now in my sister's mouth, passed down like a family recipe for dismissal. Send the tools back, I said, or Petra files tomorrow morning. She hung up. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid I'd stop being afraid somewhere between finding that folder of business registrations and hearing Petra say the word easement. I didn't sleep because I was thinking about my grandfather, about the codicil he'd filed without telling me, about the way some people protect you in advance because they already know the geography of the danger. He'd known my parents would eventually see the workshop as something to be redistributed. He'd known Renee's needs would always land heavier on the family scale, so he'd done what he always did. He'd followed the grain. He'd worked around the problem before it arrived. Tuesday, Petra filed. The formal complaint named my parents for easement violation and unauthorized removal of business personal property. It named Renee for conversion. It named Dave because two of my grandfather's handplanes, antique, irreplaceable, appraised at more than anyone in that situation wanted to be financially liable for, had apparently been moved to Dave's garage, where one had been used on a rough-cut piece of pine for a home improvement project. That detail, when Petra read it to me from the inventory the process server had documented, was the one that broke something open in me, not my grandfather's tool chest. Not the empty hooks on the wall. 100-year-old handplane my grandfather had bought at an estate sale in 1987 that he'd spent 3 weekends flattening and sharpening back to working order, used on a rough-cut pine board by a man who didn't know what he was holding. I went for a walk. I walked until I couldn't feel my hands. My parents arrived at the motel 2 days after the filing. Both of them this time, plus Renee, which meant they'd reached the stage where my mother needed witnesses for her version of events. My father looked like he'd aged. Not dramatically, just the particular exhaustion of a man who had always managed conflict by pretending it didn't exist and had run out of road. "You didn't have to do this," he said, standing in the parking lot because I hadn't opened the door all the way. "You moved my property without my knowledge or consent," I said. "I filed a civil complaint." "That's the sequence." "It's family," my mother said. The word landed the way it always landed, like it was supposed to override everything else, like it was a category that suspended ordinary rules of conduct. "Family doesn't forge easements away," I said. "Family doesn't take tools that belong to a registered business. Family doesn't hand someone else's workspace to their favorite child because she has a tasting in 2 weeks." Renee stepped forward. Her face was doing something complicated, embarrassed, resentful, a little scared. "I didn't know about the legal stuff," she said. "Mom told me it was fine." "It was never fine," I said. "You just didn't ask me. You were in Portland. You had my number." A silence opened up between us. The parking lot, the October light, the sound of a truck on the highway. I had known my sister for 29 years. I had lied for her to our parents. I had loaned her money she never repaid. I had been, for most of our lives, the one who quietly maintained the infrastructure of her good standing in the family, covering when she cancelled, smoothing over when she disappointed, absorbing what was left over so she could keep arriving bright and unburdened. She looked at me now, and I could see her doing the math. Calculating whether an apology would be cheaper than a lawsuit. "Clara," she said. Softer now. "I'm sorry. I really am. I didn't think." "I know," I said. "Can we fix this? Can we just talk to your lawyer person and explain it was a misunderstanding?" "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I said. "You understood exactly what you were taking. You just decided I wouldn't do anything about it." My mother made a sound sharp, involuntary. "That's not fair." "Which part?" I asked. She didn't answer. She never answered the questions that had real answers. My father tried next, voice low and tired. "What do you want, Clara? Tell us what you want, and we'll make it right." I thought about it. I actually thought about it, standing there in the parking lot with the wind going cold. I want every tool returned, undamaged, catalogued against my original inventory. I want the damaged plane assessed and replacement value paid. I want the workshop cleared of Renee's equipment by end of month. And I want it in writing, signed, notarized, that the easement is acknowledged and will not be interfered with again. My father looked at the ground. "And the lawsuit?" "Petra decides what happens with the complaint based on whether the above happens and how fast." Renee made a sound that was almost a laugh, not from amusement. "You've really thought about this." "I had time," I said. "You gave me a lot of time to think while I was standing in an empty workshop that should have been full." 3 weeks later, I stood in the doorway of the workshop and looked at the tool wall. Everything was back. Not perfectly, some things had been moved by people who didn't know the system, didn't know that the layout my grandfather had designed was functional, That every tool had a position relative to the bench and the light for a reason. It would take me time to put it back exactly right, but it was back. The damaged handplane had been assessed. Dave had written a check without meeting my eyes, and I had taken it without cruelty, just matter of fact, the way you accept a consequence that was earned rather than inflicted. The easement acknowledgement had been signed. My parents hadn't smiled when they did it. My mother had held the pen the way you hold something that has beaten you. My father had signed and immediately looked out the window. Renee had been the surprise she'd signed and then stayed in her chair for a moment before saying, quietly, I should have called you. I should have asked. It wasn't enough, but it was real, and I filed it away. The forgery investigation, because that's what it was, Petra had been clear. My mother had told Renee the arrangement was approved by me, which was a documented misrepresentation used to induce Renee to take possession of assets she had no right to run its own course. I didn't drive it. Petra advised me to let it proceed at its own speed. What happened with it, legally, was not my responsibility to manage. That was the hardest thing to accept. I'd spent so many years managing things that were not my responsibility that releasing one felt wrong. But I was getting better at wrong-feeling things that were actually right. The first morning I worked in the workshop after everything was returned, I didn't start on a commission. I had 3 waiting, and I'd get to them. But first, I spent an hour going through my grandfather's tool chest drawer by drawer, not looking for anything, just relearning the inventory, the weight of each thing in my hand, the logic of how he'd organized it. In the bottom drawer, under a tray of marking gauges, I found something I hadn't seen before. A small envelope, sealed, with my name on it in his handwriting. Either I'd missed it when I'd gone through the chest after he died, or he'd placed it somewhere else, and it had migrated over the years, the way things in workshops do. I sat on his old shop stool still with the dent from where I'd knocked it into the doorframe at 14 and opened it. It was short. He'd never been a man who wasted words. The wood doesn't care who claims to own the tree. It becomes what you make it, so do you. I sat with that for a while, in the workshop, in the light, in the smell of cedar and linseed oil, and something older underneath. Then, I picked up a chisel and got to work. Here is what I know now that I didn't know 6 months ago, or maybe knew but had never held firmly enough to act on. There are people who love you for what you produce, and there are people who love you for what you are. The first group is louder. The second is rarer and quieter and worth every uncomfortable thing you have to do to protect space for them. My family is not finished. My mother still calls, still uses that warm telephone voice that costs nothing. My father is still tired in that particular way of men who have spent decades letting other people's energy set the weather in their house. Renee is operating her catering business out of a commercial kitchen she finally signed a real lease on. She calls occasionally, not often, but when she does, she asks about my work first. That's new. I don't know yet what to make of it. What I know is that the workshop is mine. Not because I can prove it on paper, though I can. Because I earned it in the way that matters hour by hour and year by year, following the grain, building things that last, learning how to hold a tool without forcing it. My grandfather taught me that a piece of wood will tell you where it wants to go if you're patient enough to listen. He taught me the same was true of a life. The moment someone decides you're a resource to be allocated, that your space, your time, your tools, your history are available for redistribution based on who needs them more today, that is the moment you find out whether you belong to yourself or to their idea of you. I found out. And I found out I belonged to myself. That's the kind of thing that feels like loss until you're standing in your grandfather's workshop at 7 a.m. with sawdust on your sleeves and a chisel in your hand and the light coming in exactly right, and you realize it's the furthest thing from loss you have ever felt.